The time is just gone 10 minutes past 8 p.m. as we continue on our panel discussion tonight, Wednesday nights with Inait Wadi. And in the second hour, we are talking about the Tulsi twins. The question we are raising is the plea bargain justified? And we've learned about the Tulsi twins pleading guilty to some terror related charges. And we've learned about Brendan Lee, who will spend an effective 8 years behind bars, and his twin brother Tony Lee, 11 years behind bars after entering into a plea and sentencing agreement with the state. Are we joined by our panel this evening? Firstly, we've got Khanif Hendricks, who is the leader of the Al Jama political party. Mr. Khanif, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yes, and we also have got Dr. Ahmed Jesbai from the Media Review Network. Dr. Ahmed, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to you as well.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yes, wonderful that both of you are able to join us. Now, Buta Khanif, just before we get to this latest debacle and saga surrounding the Tulsi twins, I know the Al Jama party came out very, very strongly. And just to recap, what led to these twins now finally appearing in court and entering into this plea bargain. But a lot has been happening behind the scenes, which the Al Jama party has been party to.
Thank you very much. We've been following this case, and 6 years without a trial date and a trial judge created the perception that South Africa still has detention without trial. And 6 years like that amounts to torture in terms of the convention, and South Africa signed a convention that it will not engage in torture. So those two matters were of grave concern to the party. So we wrote to the Minister of Justice. I'm a member of the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services, because I didn't want the Sixth Parliament to get a bad name, that under our watch there's a perception that there's detention without trial. So we wanted to get to the bottom of it, and we wrote to the Minister of Justice, and in terms of the rules, the Minister of Justice has to respond in 10 days, otherwise he's in trouble with the Speaker. And we got quite a lengthy reply. And in that reply, the Minister of Justice covered himself by saying that this is the information he got from the prosecutors. And we looked at it, and the defense of the prosecutors was that the defense team of the Thulsie twins were delaying the matter, and it's not their fault, which wasn't true. What was also not true is that the minister, in response to a direct question that we asked, said that there were no foreign operatives involved and that this is a local matter, a regional matter. And in that way, Parliament has been misled, and I'm thinking of taking up that issue later on. So there were debates in Parliament where I raised the issue of South Africa still engages in torture and still engages in these lengthy 6 years, creates the perception that we have detention without trial. So that obviously caused quite a furor. And the Chief Justice, I don't know who contacted the Chief Justice, put pressure on the trial judge. And the trial judge in open court referred to me that we're putting pressure on him and that he is now going to bring matters to a head and he's not going to tolerate any further delays, and the matter has to be heard. Also, the Thulsie twins made it quite clear that they want their day in court, and when they have their day in court, they will be quite honest and explain their side of the story. And eventually, there was one piece of evidence that held up this case for, I think, 6 years, because that evidence, although it was in the file, was unlawful and unconstitutional. And it showed that America and Britain conducted undercover operations in South Africa online and supplied this information to South Africa and told South Africa, you are bound by a United Nations resolution to act harshly against any form of terrorism. Here we've now supplied you with information. So carry out your responsibility. So South Africa has been under pressure since 2016 with what is a very difficult case, because that particular evidence, is not admissible under any circumstances. It's against our constitution. And there were also issues of baiting involved, where American or British operatives, I'm not sure which, found soft targets and invited them, for example, to go and visit Syria, and invited them to, or supply them with information that was banned, well, information in books that was banned by the United Nations.
Mm.
So yes, eventually matters came to a head in court, and the two parties decided to settle the matter, and the matter was settled in Al Jamal's view in the best interests of the state and in the best interests of the accused. So that's where
Yes.
we stand. That's where we stood just before the matter came to court.
Yes,
Al Jamal
Mutaqarib, we
believes, that
we
there must
we
be
will
equal
we just want to
compromise.
we'll get to that point. I just want to bring Dr. Ahmed Jazbai into the discussion. Now, what is important to understand, Dr. Ahmed Jazbai, is it's taken basically 6 years, and to the extent where even the state had refused to provide certain information to the defense, saying that it was privileged, it was confidential, and it basically took the court to order the state to make some information available so that the defense could actually work with. And even when the matter had come to court, there was at least something of substance, because throughout the entire 6 years, these twins, these two brothers, were basically left in limbo, and nobody knew even why, in the first place, they were languishing in jail or in detention without trial for 6 years.
Yes, Inayat. I think that's one of the main issues that we're dealing here with in this whole case is the issue of secrecy. From the very onset, this entire case has been shrouded in secrecy, and even the plea agreement, to a very large extent, is shrouded in secrecy. There's a lot in which even the twins' lawyer has said that he cannot divulge at this stage because it is part of the agreement that many of the aspects will remain secret, and this has unfortunately prejudiced the twins to a very large extent. And our other guest has alluded to this issue of baiting or entrapment. It's clear that these twins were entrapped by foreign agents, U.S. and U.K. Agents, which we perhaps can speculate about, but to a very large extent, they were played on. Their emotions were played on. And they were youngsters. I think they were barely out of their teens or still in the teens. I'm not quite sure at that stage. And they were vulnerable. They were emotional, and unfortunately, at that stage, they had let slip information. They had said things that they should not have said. They had requested things that they should not have requested. And this went on for many months until such a stage in which Hanif has said that the information was eventually handed over to the South African authorities, and pressure was applied on the South African authorities to act decisively against the twins. This issue of whether it was the defense that was playing a delaying tactics game, it's neither here nor there. The the crux of the matter is that key evidence was withheld from by the prosecutors at the behest. And I think this is something that perhaps the portfolio committee can request, is that was there foreign intervention, was the pressure applied from, although the minister may have said that it may not be, but we need a meaningful investigation into this matter, because even at this stage there's a lot of secrecy, and I suspect that the secrecy around the plea agreement has to do with protecting our foreign relations with the US and the UK. We know that, for example, we have foreign operatives operating in South Africa. We know that the Mossad agents, which operate as El Al, security agents at OR Tambo International Airport, that happened in about 10 years ago, but suddenly the whole issue went quiet. So we know that these things happen, and we need some sort of meaningful investigation to unearth who was behind this and to what extent were they entrapped and baited.
Well, certainly, and I think Buta Hanif, obviously, Dr. Ahmed Jazbay raises quite a few issues with regard to the portfolio committee and also looking at some of the international consequences. Now, just looking at this case in particular, and obviously, in terms of face value, they were charged with having certain books and material and the like. Some of the charges that were actually dropped include things like financing terrorist activities, soliciting support for terrorist organizations, and they mentioned ISIL as an example. But it is clear that this speaks volumes about South Africa, about our justice system, but more particularly looking at South Africa and where we are in this fight against terror, as defined by the likes of the United States of America, by the international world in terms of how they see this war on terror, and obviously looking at South Africa and looking at their definition of the war on terror and imposing it on this country.
Yes, look, the challenges are many, and I just want to refer to possession of, let's call it banned literature. In the days of apartheid, if you had banned literature in your possession, then you would serve 10 years, 20 years in jail just for having the literature in your possession. And that is part of our terror laws as well at the moment. So there's something wrong with it. I remember my mom had a safe house in District 6, and Judge Fikali Bam, after visiting a house, he was accosted, and they found a pamphlet in his pocket of a Chinese terrorist outfit at the time, and he served 10 years in jail. So our terror laws, have, that's an omission, that there should not be space in the terror laws to allow someone to be incarcerated or found guilty of terrorism if they have ideological literature in their possession. And the judge, when he gave his judgment, made it clear that in his court no one will be sentenced for having ideological material in their possession. However, if they start implementing it, then that is an act that is criminal. So we must look at the plea bargain. It's largely, I would call it, mitigation, before sentencing and before findings. The plea bargain indicates that one of the twins admitted to having a book which was sent to him by these British or American operatives, and he printed it out. But that book was banned by the United Nations. It is banned, and South Africa is a signatory to that convention, and has no choice but to act on it like the judge did. So one of them was sentenced for having that material in his possession, and he admitted because the Thulsie twins, they took a decision that they're going to be honest and take the court into its confidence. So they said, yes, we are guilty of that. We had that book in our possession, and the judge obviously reasoned, oh, well, if you have that in your possession, that's 20 years in jail, just like Judge Fikeli Bam got 10 years for that pamphlet, and other people got even more time in jail for having communism literature in their possession and so on. So, as a member of the Sixth Parliament, we are very concerned about defending the freedoms that we won. And I already mentioned detention without trial, I mentioned torture, and also, that there's freedom of expression, and one has a right to read, to find out, and just because you have that particular literature in your possession doesn't mean that you've committed a crime. But in terms of the United Nations, and South Africa at that time was part of the Security Council, although we didn't have a vote. They now have to, they now have to follow those prescripts. So Al Zamai is seriously thinking of submitting a private member's bill to amend some of the clauses in the legislation on terror. So we now have quite a number of issues because, as you know, I served as a member of the Joint Committee on Intelligence for a while, especially to help the passing of the budgets, because they need representatives from opposition parties to pass a budget. And our intelligence services is in a mess, and that's why they interviewing and intelligence has now been placed in the presidency. And on the second day of the July looting, I told the president, that the country is not in safe hands, in spite of him fearing that it was. And look what has happened since then. So I think the focus is on internal security, but we have to start raising the issue of interference by foreign operatives in the intelligence affairs of South Africa. We are quite capable to run our own affairs. We don't need America and Britain to come and tell us and interfere and have undercover operations. That is they are attacking our independence. That's an infringement. That's unconstitutional. It's not allowed. And that's why we find that the judge, the defense, the prosecution, a plea bargain was for all parties the best option.
Yes.
And all the
No.
twins did was to say, yes, we had a book, but that carries 20 years imprisonment.
Hmm.
And the other
Dr.
twins
Hanif,
said, yes,
yes, I just,
yes.
I just want, obviously, I think from what you're saying, that it's in the best interest of everyone. And I just want Dr. Ahmed Jazbai's comment on this, where the thing is, in a case of justice, it's not about a win-win situation for all. And I think this is where the question mark has been raised that, what lies actually behind this plea bargain? Is there another, is it justified? And this is the question that I am raising because when one looks at, obviously they pleaded guilty to having the literature that Puta Khanif is talking about, but also at the same time, when one looks at some of the charges that they've been talking about, serious charges, we're talking about conspiracy to commit terrorist attack. Now, how does one actually define a conspiracy to commit a terrorist attack? to the extent that the state gave evidence talking about an intended attack on the US, UK, Russian, or French diplomats and embassies in Pretoria and certain Jewish interests. So, there again, I think huge question marks are being raised, Dr. Ahmed Jesbai.
Yes, most certainly. I think the fact that the state entered into a plea bargain, whilst it may have been in the best interest of all parties concerned, also points to some extent to the weakness of their case on many of the other counts. Many of the other, I think it was 11 of the 12 counts, which were dropped. When it comes to the issue of the main count, which they pleaded guilty to, it must be noted that it points to again the law. This law on terrorism is is quite open to interpretation. The fact that it does not take much to prove conspiracy. Just having banned material, being in contact, so-called contact with a ISIL operative, and I think that ISIL operative was if we probably US UK, most likely US intelligent operative. So we've got to deal with the law, the terrorism law. The Terrorism Act. It's got quite a long name, and in this sense, being baited, being entrapped by foreign agents over a period of time gave the operatives sufficient evidence in which to hand over to South Africa's state security agency. So we must look at this law, and I'm glad that Brother Khanif has said that that Al Jama is interested in going with a private members bill to have much to attempt to have the law amended, or certain clauses of the law amended, because it appears that it's quite easy to convict anyone of conspiracy to commit a terrorist attack. I wonder if one, and I'm sure many people have, some people may have the ISIL flag. Is that, will that be a grounds to be convicted for on a terrorism charge? It's certainly not grounds to have if one has an apartheid flag. We see it frequently being flown at rugby matches around the world. In fact, in the UK, most predominantly, but even in South Africa. But it's not against the law. So it appears that it does not take much to get a terrorism conviction. And I think the twins, having been unjustly incarcerated for 6 years, decided that perhaps this is instead of facing, for example, 25 years in prison, that they'd rather cut their losses to some extent. And one of the brothers has 2.5 years to spend more, and another around 4.5 years, but I stand corrected regarding the exact amount. So we need to get to the crux of this matter, and the crux of the matter is that our state intelligence agency, is it being influenced by foreign agents or foreign intelligence agencies? We know that intelligence agencies around the world collaborate on intelligent matters, and as well as we need to get to this issue of the Terrorism Act, and the easy manner it is to get someone convicted on a terrorism charge. In fact, this is the first case of international terrorism for which this act was applied. Previously, it was Burma attacks around Gauteng in which this law was applied, but this was the first international case. So we need to get answers regarding the issue of collaboration with foreign intelligence agencies, because that speaks to, and Brother Khanif spoke to this, it speaks to a violation of our sovereignty to a very large extent. And again, it also speaks to this issue of the war on terror. I mean, this case, we cannot divorce it from the bigger picture, which is the global war on terror, and the desire of the proponents of the war on terror to get all countries around the world in order to toe the line of the global war on terror. And their Islamophobic agenda, which is to malign and to vilify Muslims the world over. With this case, we've already seen, if you on social media, you've seen many comments on Muslims being terrorists and so on, that they've admitted, and ISIL is now in South Africa, and there's going to be an ISIL takeover of South Africa. We've seen this. We've seen this already on social media, and this again, this, as I said, speaks to the agenda of the war on terror, which is to construct, as I mentioned in an earlier interview, this good Muslim and this bad Muslim. If you are one that conforms to the status quo and adheres to the war on terror and the narrative of the war on terror, you are a good Muslim. If you challenge this ideology of the war on terror, then you are a bad Muslim. You are not the Muslim in which these global intelligence agencies and much of the Western world wants to construct. We've seen it in France, we've seen it in many countries around the world.
Yes, Buddha Hanif, just coming back to the Act, and we're talking about the 2004 Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorist and Related Activities Act, which is PAC, POCDATARA. That's the acronym for this Act. And just looking at this Terrorism Act, now we've seen right across the entire world, and Dr. Ahmed just by saying that looking at the international benchmark as far as terror is concerned, and when one looks at how terror or the war on terror is being managed in many other parts around the world, we've seen how countries like Britain, like the United States of America, in terms of their legislation, homeland security, and all sorts of legislation was passed as a direct consequence of the war on terror. And looking at South Africa, looking at this act in its present form, what is wrong with this act? And are we in danger? Are we in danger of going the route like the United States and the United Kingdom in this war against terror using legislation?
Look, I think we need to make it quite clear that there is no place for terrorism in South Africa, although we had the Boer Mag. They've been guilty of some offences. They got bail quickly. And also, their sentences were not very harsh. And so the act, the Terror Act, has been applied, but that's not what America and Britain and friends of Israel want. They want Muslims to be nailed. They want to create the narrative that there is a rise in Islamic extremism, and you've alluded to it in South Africa. At the time that the Thulsie twins were arrested, I gave a keynote address at Potchefstroom University, and Professor Harun and Naeem Jinnah, they gave other papers in support on whether there's a rise in Islamic extremism in South Africa, because there were representatives from Poland, America, Britain, all over the world who felt, there's no contest, there is no legislation, or there is legislation that is not strong enough, and that South Africa is soft on terror, and there were many false flags. America sending out messages to the embassies that there's an imminent attack, terror attack in South Africa, all of those things that they're trying to nail the Muslim community. And when, because there is no Islamic extremism, the operatives, to earn their keep and their money, and also the spies that we have amongst so many sectors of our community, they had to earn their keep, and they had to come up with a conviction. And this was like an opportunity to show that there is Islamic extremism and a rise in Islamic extremism. You indicated that there are concerns that ISIL will invade South Africa. They don't have a hell of a chance to do that. And we understand what the issues are in Mozambique, and it is being exploited. But I don't want to go into that, except to say that the Americans and the British and the Friends of Israel may now be happy that there has been a conviction. So they're now going to push a narrative that there is Islamic terrorism in South Africa because those two twins happen to be Muslims, although they recently converted when they were arrested, and they were arrested like doctor said while they were teenagers. They will now push that narrative, but the plea bargain must not be seen as an indication that there is Islamic extremism or rise in Islamic extremism in South Africa, because the Muslim community is one of the most peaceful communities in the country, and all the mainstream Muslim organizations and thought leaders have made it quite clear that we've got no time for outfits such as ISIL and Al Qaeda and so on. And Al Jamaa has taken the position that if we have issues, we use the parliamentary process. That's why we formed a political party. And that's why we're active in parliament to address a lot of issues, to defend the rights of especially Muslims. Although we've now also we have quite a lot of communities outside the Deen that's also associated with us. Our emphasis is to defend when Muslims are under attack, and the reason that we took a strong stand here is because the hidden agenda was to start pushing the narrative that there's extremism, Islamic extremism in South Africa, and there's a rise in Islamic extremism. I mean, that's all nonsense.
Yes. Now, Dr. Ahmed Jazbai, when one looks at South Africa and its position as far as the war on terror is concerned, now this is a clear example where one looks at the Tulsi twins and these charges that were brought against them. But on the other hand, there is a lot that the South African government lets go. When one looks at the number of mercenaries that have been involved in other countries, that have gone through, that have fought, that have killed, we know of mercenaries going into Israel that are being trained in South Africa and then going across and killing innocent people, innocent Palestinians. Not very long ago, a few months ago, there was this young South African Jewish boy that was killed in Israel because he went for that very reason. And that created huge discussion, huge debate, and also a statement that was issued by the government here in South Africa. Now, what I'm saying is, uh, technically, we may play around with definitions as to what constitutes terror, what doesn't constitute terror. But the fact of the matter is, there are people that are leaving this country, going out of this country, killing people, innocent people. Where in the past we've even heard about mercenaries who went into Iraq as well. So there are many, many examples that one can cite. Now, against the background of that, here once again we're talking about a conspiracy to commit a terrorist attack where people have actually gone and they've actually killed people in other countries.
Yes, most certainly. I think the most pointed example is that of South Africans, Jewish South Africans serving in the Israeli terrorist forces, and uh, and there's been a number of them, and they proudly and publicly state this on social media, be it Facebook, be it Twitter, be it Instagram, or whatever part of social media. We've seen this being stated. So the South African government, obviously, as Brother Khanif pointed out, was under immense pressure to make this terrorism act not about anyone else, but specifically about Muslims. And they were obviously baited. These young, naive, emotional youngsters were entrapped, and they succeeded to some extent to push this narrative of Islamic extremism in South Africa. We've seen this being pushed for a number of years since the turn of the century by self-styled terrorism experts or self-styled terrorism experts and academics, terror analysts, think tank analysts, and so on, who argue that there is a terrorism problem in South Africa. We've seen this around the 2010 Soccer World Cup, where we've had this narrative being pushed of impending attack on on the World Cup, and we saw nothing happen. And it is obvious that there was pressure to ensure that this becomes about Muslims. And what better way to do that is to lure someone online. We know foreign agents operate online, and they will give you what you want in order to lure you greater, more and more insight into the trap that they lay, and then they pass it off to local authorities. So we know of people going to Iraq, unfortunately those that went to Syria and so on. But and as well as it appears that those that go to Israel, although this is in contravention of the Foreign Military Assistance Act, uh, for a South African citizen to serve in a foreign army. We know Jewish South Africans do it with glee, and they do it all the time. And it's high time that the South African government becomes uh, fair and just in its approach, and to prosecute those that leave South Africa to go, be it in American army, be it in any army, and especially the Israeli army, and prosecute those. There's evidence that has been presented and will be presented to South African authorities for Jewish South Africans who are in violation of Foreign Military Assistance Act. So it's clear that the playing ground, or the law, is not applied fairly and justly, and it's only applied when there is pressure from outside to act. Of course, there's never going to be pressure on South Africans who visit Israel, but it's up to us to ensure that we put pressure on government, provide evidence to government, so that it can be seen to be acting justly in all laws of the country, especially those in which, for example, such as the terrorism law, such as Foreign Military Assistance Act, in which many South Africans, hundreds of South Africans, are in violation of.
Yes. Now, Buta Khanif, just on the issue of these Tulsi twins, and we have been talking about them being lured by possible foreign agents. And when one looks at the Tulsi twins, when one looks at their background, and obviously they've come from the poorest of the poor. They lost their father. Their father was killed. They grew up with their mother. And when one looks at just the background in terms of the family, and they become easy pickings for foreign agents. And this is where the big problem comes in, is when two young children in their teenage years are basically lured. And this is something that one needs to be watchful of, one needs to be careful of as well. But at the same time, looking at it from the government's perspective, the government needs to be aware of this, that sometimes when you have socio-economic dynamics playing out in a family, and when these type of pickings take place, it's just they become easy meat, they become easy targets. And this is the reason why we've seen these two young children languishing for 6 years and forgotten. And we know from time to time a few statements were being made in terms of raising concerns, but they were basically left to the powers that be. They were left to the mercy of the powers that be. And finally, it has basically come to this. And I know, thanks to people like yourself, the Al Jama Party, for raising this issue and bringing it out into the open.
Look, I just want to make it clear that they did not, that 12 charges were dropped. Some of the charges that you referred to, like promoting terrorism and bombings and all of that, there was absolutely no evidence. It was the figment of someone's imagination just to build up a strong case. And all those charges had no evidence, had no, supporting evidence, and they were all dropped. So it was position of, let's say, communist literature, similar to that. And secondly, the one twin admitted that he wanted to go and live in an
In
Islamic
Syria.
state where the Sharia is practiced, and he was advised that the nice place to go to was Syria, and the issue of them funding terrorism. These are poor kids. Where must they get the funds from? Rob a bank. So we find that most of the charges were dropped, but they pleaded guilty to what they told the truth that yes, I had a book. Yes, I wanted to go to Syria. And that's why we want to tell young people that are being lured into this. There are many neighborhoods and suburbs in South Africa where there's a very good Islamic environment where you can feel comfortable to live Islam. There's no need to leave the country.
Yes, if I may come in on that point, Inayat, it's important that there is some sort of education, online education in the Muslim community, be it our Islamic schools, be it our madaris, and so on, when it comes to this issue of, ISIL and so on, and to be wary of who they speak to online, because many people, I mean, you get many keyboard warriors on Twitter and Facebook and so on, who hide behind a Twitter handle, hide behind a Facebook page, and become real Facebook lions and Twitter lions and so on. And they sometimes, these are sometimes foreign agents who, as Brother Khanif pointed out, this is these were very poor and vulnerable youngsters. So we need education in the Muslim community to guard against this issue resurfacing, to guard against this issue happening again in this community, so that the entire Muslim community is not maligned in this matter. I mean, just admitting, someone on Twitter mentioned that these two kids wanted to bomb the U.S. embassy, the Jewish embassy, the UK embassy, and other targets, while simultaneously bombing themselves up. I mean, at what time, at what point were they going to bomb themselves? After the last target or after the first target? I mean, it was simply something that was probably said in jest, or probably said in frustration and anger, and an emotional outburst. But this was unfortunately something that got recorded, and in which they will now spend a few more years in jail for. So it's important that online education happens in our communities at all levels. From the pulpit, from the minaret. The pulpits, and whether it be in schools and madrasa, to guard against this. I mean, we can live proper Islamic lifestyles within our communities, even in communities where we are a minority, without being lured to think that this Islamic utopia that many people point out during the early days of ISIL, in Syria and parts of Iraq. So important point to take home is that online education has to be, especially amongst our youngsters, especially amongst the vulnerable, poor communities who see the suffering of the Muslim ummah and want to act, want to do something, and unfortunately get caught up in places, get caught up with people who are not who they say they are, and eventually now have to serve some jail time for those crimes.
Well, certainly, and I think just while you're on that subject, and I'm glad you brought this thing up, Dr. Ahmed Jazbai, because this is all part of an understanding of political Islam as well, because this is something that we tend to shy away from when we are discussing, and within the whole spectrum of political Islam, all these issues basically come in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of providing education, in terms of providing training, and not to be caught up, where you open yourself, or where you are at huge risk of being called a terrorist, because we've seen this over and over again. We've seen even those prisoners that were languishing in Guantanamo Bay, and many of the prisons right across the entire world, in Muslim countries and out of Muslim countries, that have basically been charged with something similar to what we are talking about, where they haven't committed the deed, but at the end of the day, just out of suspicion alone, they get caught in this. And again, like you mentioned, social media, absolutely important, critical. One needs to be watchful how one behaves on social media.
Certainly, I mean, social media, as I always say, is a wonderful tool to use to promote Deen in this country, to promote Deen around the world. It gives a voice to sometimes to those who may not have a voice. But it is extremely risky form of media. It's extremely risky form of information sharing, and it's important to know that nothing that one says online is temporary, that can be deleted. I mean, if you think you can say that I love ISIL on Twitter and suddenly delete it 10 seconds later, sorry, it's not deleted, it's permanently there. It's either screen grabs have taken, and in the case of the Thulsie twins, I mean, their homes were raided and so on, and I suspect their devices were taken, and with the help of foreign agencies, they comb through the devices, and you can recoup anything that has been lost on your device with the correct persons. And we've seen, for example, with Israel's Pegasus spyware, how easy it is to, which many states have bought and used against their own citizens. Uh, also the WhatsApp, which is considered, encrypted and the most secure form of communication, but not with Pegasus. Pegasus will be able to get into your phone. It does not need you to press any link or anything of that sort, or as how a lot of spyware and malware works. It can get onto your phone, and many of these conversations that you may have with your friends and so on, unfortunately, can be used against you. So this is an exceptionally important point. These were two naive youngsters, and unfortunately, they got caught up, and now they're going to have a criminal record against them, and they most probably won't be able to leave the country going forward.
Yes, but Hanif, we've got about 3 minutes. Just some final thoughts from your side for about a minute or two before we get Dr. Ahmed Jazbai to share his final thoughts with us.
Yeah, Al-Jamaa will continue to defend Muslims when they are affected in Parliament like we did. The Boerenmag, half a dozen of them were convicted of in terms of terrorism, but no one calls the Afrikaners terrorists. When we had the July unrest, some of the acts committed by half a dozen Zulus amounted to terrorism, but no one calls the Zulu nation terrorists. But when we have one plea bargain like this, the Muslim community is now marked as being a terrorist community, and Islam gets a bad name. So there's a bit of a double standards here, and we just need to guard against it. That's why the work of the Media Review Network is very important, and Al Jamaa, where it can, will also continue to play its role. I think it's very important that when the Thulsie twins are released on parole, if they qualify for parole, that the Muslim community must educate them, like Doctor has said, that they need to have a different understanding because they are new to Islam, and that we need to support them to get jobs and education and so on, because that's what we have to do. If any of our young people are along the way, we need to lift them up and assist them. And I'm very disappointed in some Sikhs, blaming extremists, Maulanas for this, and they should also be locked up. The competition amongst the ulama is a problem during this particular debate, and even Al Jamaa is being accused of supporting terrorism. But we just ignore that. But thank you to Salam Media for unpacking what has been happening, so that the Muslim community can understand the bigger picture and the wider implications.
Shukran for that, Buta Hanif. Dr. Ahmed Jazbai, just final thoughts?
Yes, quickly. I think we must connect the dots to the larger picture, which is the war on terror, Islamophobia. This case needs to be connected to Islamophobia, the war on terror, and entrapment. And we need to ensure that we educate South Africans, Muslim South Africans, on this issue, and to understand that this was not, and not to become apologists, for the Western narrative on terrorism and so on, to say that, this was acts of terrorism and so on, and we must condemn it. that's one element, but we must understand that this entire exercise, this entire case was aimed to vilify Muslims, to bring the South African government into the global war on terror, and to ensure that we construct the good Muslim, the obedient Muslim, one that will toe the line and one that will be uncritical of the larger picture in the world.
Well, Jazakallah khairan so much to both of you, to Dr. Hanif Hendricks and Dr. Ahmed Jazbai. We appreciate you taking time out talking to us this evening on Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi. All the best to you, inshallah. Allah keep you safe. Allah accept your efforts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum
Alaikum
salam.
salam. Shukran.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of Wednesday Nights with myself, Inayat Wadi, and unpacking two very, very important issues: the issue surrounding the AU and the accreditation of Israel, and also the Thulsie twins. And with that, I'm going to be signing off, and I'll be back with you once again, same time, same place, yeah, on Salam Media from myself and the team. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi